From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Augustine Obour will discuss the impact of grazing cattle on cover crops on soil health. That's the topic he'll address at a K-State Cover Crops Field Day next Wednesday at Ellsworth. He's conducted multiple site research on this and will share what he's found out. Also, we'll meet the director of the new Office for Farm and Ranch Transition here at K-State, Ashlee Westerhold. She'll talk about the threefold mission of that office in assisting farm and ranch families in their succession planning. And on this week's horticulture segment, further ahead, K-State's Dennis Patton will talk about container gardening and getting those potted plants off to a good start. All that here on Agriculture Today. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today, and thanks once more for making us part of your morning. Well, our first guest has a speaking part in a special cover crop field day coming up next week in central Kansas, hosted by the Midway Extension District in Ellsworth County. Augustine Obour joining us now. Augustine is a soil scientist at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. He has studied cover crop utilization for quite some time now. Augustine, your angle that you'll be addressing in this field day is grazing cover crops and the impacts on soil bulk density and compaction and overall soil health. And you have devoted a fair amount of time to this over the years, haven't you?
Yes, Eric. We've done quite a bit of work looking at grazing cover crops in dryland systems because we figured the best way to integrate cover crops in water-limited environments is to actually have some economic benefit for these cover crops. And the best way in doing this is actually grazing cover crops.
What questions have you been trying to answer in as far as the impact of that on the state of the soil itself?
Yeah, so one of the barriers to adoption of grazing cover crops is potential issues of grazing on soil compaction, because if you graze a cover crop, you introduce livestock. So livestock moving around can cause issues of soil compaction. And then the other issue is if you remove the residue, you graze it, you remove quite a bit of residue. So if you're doing that, it can have some negative impact on soil health. So in my research, we are trying to answer these questions. Does grazing impact soil bulk density? And does grazing also negate some of the soil health benefits from cover crops? So that's what we've been doing for the past 6 years. We have research on our own research farm near Cedar Bluff Dam, and then we're also doing this research on producer fields across western Kansas.
Now, are you evaluating different types of cover crops to gauge this impact?
Yeah, so we are looking at both summer cover crops that is planted after wheat harvest. We are also looking at spring-type cover crops that are planted in place of fallow. So these spring cover crops are planted in March and grazed in June and then terminated somewhere in the later part of June. And we are also looking at fall-planted cover crops. So the fall-planted cover crops are actually being evaluated at Ellsworth. So those are planted in August or September. They are grazed sometime in January through February, and they are terminated in May. So we're covering all kinds of cover crop planting windows across western Kansas.
And you're looking at legumes, you're looking at brassicas, quite a swath of cover crop classes there?
Yes, so we are looking at we're looking at cool season cover crops, mixtures. We have grasses mixed with brassicas and legumes in cover crop studies. And then the post-wheat cover crops are mostly Sudan grass, millet, sunham, cowpeas, and then radishes that we plant in the summer.
Well, let's take a quick look here at some of the discoveries that you've made in as far as grazing those cover crops, turning cattle out to utilize them as a forage, and what that means to the condition of the soil. What are you finding?
Yeah, sure. One thing that we've been looking at quite a bit is looking at how much residue do we have following grazing of these cover crops. Mm-hmm. It turns out the grazing density that these producers are using in our own research is removing about 30% of the amount of forage available. So we are leaving quite a bit of residue on the soil surface. So because of that high residue cover, we are not impacting the soil structure that much. When we talk about soil structure, what we are measuring there is aggregate stability. We are not seeing any much influence of grazing cover crop on wind erosion potential, where we have grazed cover crops or non-grazed cover crops. And we've also not seen any negative effect on soil organic matter content. Actually, where we have cover crops that we graze or we do not graze, the soil organic matter content, soil aggregate stability is greater than situations where we compared it with fallow. So that is good news that producers can graze these cover crops and not have any negative effect on soil organic matter content. And actually, in most situations, we tend to increase the soil organic matter content, and consistently we've been able to improve aggregate stability compared to fallow when we graze the cover crops.
That really is a clean bill of health when it comes to grazing those cover crops, that there are no apparent adverse impacts here on soils.
Yes, and then the elephant in the room is the effect on bulk density. Mm-hmm. So what we've been doing is also monitoring bulk density. We measure soil bulk density, which is a measure of soil compaction, and then we also did penetration resistance measurements. And we haven't seen any negative effects of grazing cover crops versus non-grazed cover crop on soil bulk density. In general, our bulk density measurements range from about 1.23 to 1.3 grams per centimeter cube with fallow and then our cover crop studies. We did not see any negative effects. So in general, we are not seeing any significant effect of grazing on soil bulk density. In 1 year, though, when we had cover crops in the field, that was 2015, May, we had one day where we had the cattle out there, and we have about 4 inches of rainfall overnight. And the following day, we have to take the cattle out. And in that situation, we had a slight increase in bulk density in the top 2 inches. Below the top 2 inches, we did not see any negative effects. So there is some potential. If you have the cattle out there and it rains overnight, you want to move the cattle from the field. Otherwise, you can't get some compaction. But that compaction that we measured was just in the top 2 inches. Beyond that, we did not see any increase in bulk density where we grazed the cattle versus where we did not graze the cattle or the fallow treatment. So that is the only situation where we have that compaction issue. And it did not affect the subsequent winter wheat yields.
Wanted to ask about the yields from the crop following the cover crop. In this case, primarily you were looking at wheat?
Yeah, primarily we are looking at wheat and sorghum. So one thing that we found is in some years, we did not see any difference in yields between where we have the cover crops or where we have at fallow. In some years, when it's very dry, we tend to see a yield drag between where we had the cover crops versus where we left as summer fallow. So that is where the grazing or using the cover crop for forage becomes very important. So if you use the cover crop for forage, you get an immediate economic benefit because you are getting a value for your cover crop. So that will offset any yield drags that you had with the cover crop. So that gives you some money to compensate for your cover crop seed and also any yield decreases from growing the cover crop. So that is very, very important. So you get some benefit from these cover crops economically to compensate for any yield losses. And one thing that we also found is when we grow these cover crops and we graze the cover crop, in years where we have a yield decrease, there's no yield differences between where we graze the cover crops or where we did not graze the cover crop. The impact on the subsequent yields is the same. So if we use the cover crop for forage, we get an economic benefit compared to where we did not use the cover crop for forage.
All in all, it's a very favorable report card on grazing cover crops and as far as the soil quality impacts. And you'll be talking about this further at this upcoming field day next Wednesday, March the 30th. two locations, the crop field itself near Ellsworth, just outside of town, and then there will be a meeting and presentations to follow in Ellsworth. And you're hoping that producers will come out and learn about this and a number of other aspects of cover crop utilization, Augustine.
Yeah, sure. We wanted more producers to come up to listen to some of these cover crop talks. There will be a producer who is we are doing this on the producer field. So the producer will also be talking about what he's been seeing on his field. And we will look at utilizing cover crops for weed control. And then there will be a talk on effects of grazing cover crops on weed control. And then I'll also talk about the impact of grazing cover crops on soil health. So this will be a fully packed field day with a lot of information on grazing cover crops in dryland systems.
Great opportunity to pick up some pointers on succeeding with those systems. Again, this is set for Wednesday, March the 30th, next week, and it'll start at the cover crop field 1.5 miles west of Ellsworth on Avenue K, 3 o'clock. And it'll continue then at 4 o'clock with the meeting and presentations at the Recreation Center in Ellsworth. There is a meal provided at the conclusion, so they're asking you to register in advance to provide that meal count. No cost to attend, but register this Friday, March the 25th, no later, at midway.k-state.edu/events. midway.k-state.edu/events, put on by the Midway Extension District for K-State Research and Extension. Augustine, wishing you the best with that presentation. We appreciate the quick summary of your work right here, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eric.
He's Augustine Obour, soil scientist at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. More coming your way shortly. You're listening to Agriculture Today. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Well, it's our pleasure on this part of the broadcast to tell you about a new service here at Kansas State University out of the Department of Agricultural Economics, and with the individual who's been named as the director of that service. It is called the Office for Farm and Ranch Transition. And as the title would imply, it will address a key issue of interest in agriculture and with farm and ranch families around the state. Ashlee Westerhold is with us. She was just selected recently as the director of this brand new initiative. And Ashlee, welcome. First of all, good to have you here at K-State.
Thank you for having me, Eric. I'm excited to be here.
And you have experience and then some in this whole arena of agricultural operational transition. Tell us about that, if you would.
So I have actually been working alongside Dr. Ron Hansen for a lot of my career, and Dr. Hansen is a professor emeritus now for the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he spent 40-plus years talking about family succession planning all around the country. And because of his life goal of trying to help farm families out, I just felt so drawn to that topic. Additionally, I had family friends and family members who have gone through transitions or are currently going through transitions. So I've seen kind of both sides of the coin of being that younger generation trying to come in and being that older generation trying to phase out. And I just fell in love with the process of trying to help these people with family communication and family business matters that help them transfer one generation to the next. I've found that in my career, that was a huge need at every state that I had been in. So I first started at Nebraska with Dr. Ron Hansen as my advisor, and then I was able to accept a job at the University of Idaho. And during my interview process at the University of Idaho, they talked about succession planning being a huge need for their state. And it had been just a long time before someone felt comfortable talking to producers about this succession or transitioning to the next generation. And I just kind of hit the ground running, talking about topics, discussing how you should have family meetings that are not just about business practices, but actually about the health of the business overall and goals, and lining up those values with the family members to kind of continue that legacy.
It takes a unique skill set to embrace this whole idea of farm and ranch transition or succession, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that someone needs to have when they're talking to these farm and ranch families is active listening skills. These families have so much history that they want to pass on to their next generation that they don't know if the next generation understands. And a lot of my job is listening to their concerns and their fears and trying to help them get to that next step in moving forward in a succession plan.
You have taken on this new role to direct this brand new office for farm and ranch transition out of Kansas State University. Explain in your words the mission of that office, if you would.
So the mission of the office, in my eyes, and I have written down this mission statement, is to keep Kansas ag land with farmers and ranchers. So trying to still keep farms and ranches with farmers and ranchers. So trying to keep the ag land in ag production and make sure that we are passing on that passion of farming and ranching to this next generation. So a really cool thing about this office is that we're not only targeting family transfers, we're targeting non-relation transfers as well. A lot of the people that are interested in farming and ranching and coming back into a farm and ranch don't have one to go back to. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of this office has to deal with just keeping farms and ranches in farming and ranching for Kansas.
Then does the office serve in a consultation role here? Is that its purpose?
The office has three overarching objectives. The first one is developing a land link program, which we would link those beginning farmers and ranchers that are interested in farming and ranching with a older generation who wants to transfer out. And they do not necessarily have that next generation who want to come back. And so that is our first objective. But our second one of the grant is a one-on-one consultation with myself or the farm analyst Lavelle Windsor or David Keller across the state right now to talk about succession planning, but look at your finances. So a big part of succession planning is understanding if this business is viable to pass on to the next generation. And then our third objective is to really target those beginning farmer and ranchers to make sure they have the tools and skill set needed to take over a farm. And so have workshops or classes that target those beginning farmer and ranchers. And so, yes, there are consultations that are involved, and those could be with family members. Those could be with our Land Link participants. They could be with people who don't even know where to start when we talk about this process of transitioning the farm or succession planning.
Sounds like there will be flexibility built into the program here to address what will be unique needs of each situation.
Yes, every situation in succession or transition planning is unique to the operation. Just because something worked with your neighbor next door and their children does not mean that will work for you and your specific circumstance. These consultations would lend themselves to us looking at your unique operation, understanding how the business is currently ran, how would you like it ran in the future, and what kind of values would you like that next generation to hold to make sure that they keep that legacy alive of this farm or ranch. And again, it does not have to be family relations that are taking this over, but just someone who's interested in agriculture and has the passion that you have. So, for example, if you are a no-till operation and you are very concerned about soil health or other practices, and you want someone to take over the farm that share that value of really being a good steward of the land, and that's something that we would want to talk about in these kind of consultation meetings.
There's sort of a matchmaking element to this, isn't there?
And so the Land Link is a matchmaking process where I'm the matchmaker. So you are not going on an app to find your own match. We are helping you. And so in this process as well, these applications will be strong enough to know that both parties are serious about this. And we are going to hopefully launch our website here soon so that we can start taking those applications.
And wanted to bring that up. The building blocks have been coming together on this office and its services for several months now.
Yes. So as of right now, I have actually been meeting with farmers and ranchers one-on-one already and understand that I am willing to come out to your farm. I am willing to be in front of audience groups, and I'm not going to wait until we have a website to start this process.
So you're open for business.
So I am open for business. Again, the applications for the LandLink program are not quite as open, but I am trying to talk to producers who would be interested in participating in the LandLink of what our goals are and what they can prepare for now when that application becomes live.
You have been, as you said, Ashlee, been referenced already, but what's the best way that individuals interested in what the office can provide here and now can contact you to pursue that?
Yeah, so the best way to contact me today is by email, ashleecw@ksu.edu. So that is my email, ashleecw@ksu.edu. Another way you can reach me is by my telephone in my office, which is 785-532-4526.
Want to ask one more thing because it will pop to mind with a lot of folks. Are there fees associated with the service whatsoever?
For right now, we are working with this large grant that Robin Reed was able to apply for and get called the Beginning Farmer Rancher Development Program. And so this grant is for 3 years, and so the services that we are offering are subsidized this year. And so that will be for the next 3 years. And then we will be looking at a fee structure.
Didn't mention that earlier. This is all on the strength of a USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture grant, $745,000 to cover the first 3 years of the center's operation. Wishing you all the best as you embark on this and the objectives that the office is going to fulfill. Ashlee, we appreciate the time and the overview, and we will talk again soon, undoubtedly. Many thanks to you.
Thank you.
She's the newly appointed director of the new Office for Farm and Ranch Transition here at K-State. That's Ashlee Westerhold. And again, you can contact her directly if you have interest in what the office is providing currently, as well as what's coming on down the line. Likewise, you can email Ashlee at ashleecw@ksu.edu, or you can call her directly on campus, 785-532-4526. We'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today and our horticulture segment for this week. This week and next, we'll be talking about home gardening from both the ornamental and vegetable perspectives. On two approaches, this week, container gardening. Next week, we'll get into raised bed gardening. With us for this is Dennis Patton, Johnson County Extension Horticulture Agent. So, Dennis, container gardening, a great way for those, particularly with only limited space available in their home setting, to enjoy gardening to the fullest.
Correct. Yeah. Container gardening has long been popular. And I think when you think of containers, we usually think of those pots of flowers on the front porch, but certainly it can be vegetables, it can be flowers, it can be a combination of those. It's just like all good gardening practice. It's right plant, right place. So if you're growing vegetables, you need a sunny location. And, if you're doing flowers, of course, there's flowers that run the gamut from sun to shade. So, it's back to the same thing. Assess your situation and then get the right pot, soil, and plants to fit that location.
Right to the core of this, and that is the growing medium, if you will, in which these plants might thrive. You bring up the potting soil. That's the ultimate, isn't it, in as far as making this work?
I think when it comes to container gardens, I think it's a combination of the container, what holds the soil, and then what soil put in it. Any container has to have drainage holes because one of the drawbacks to container gardening is a little more watering. So you have to have a drainage hole, and then you have to have high quality soil in the pot itself. And maybe I shouldn't be using the word soil. I should maybe using the term potting mix, because most of our containers, the soil we use is soilless. It has no dirt from the yard in it. The soil is all a combination of organic matter, pine bark, vermiculite, perlite, compost, something that's very light, very airy, that holds a lot of aeration, but also holds a lot of water. And so if we just dig up soil from our garden and put it in a container, more than likely we're going to have poor results. So the container has to have good quality potting mix to have success.
We see products on the market, potting mixes with fertilizer as a component of that. How important is that to be selective there?
You know, those potting mixes we find, like you said, a lot of times come with, feed your plants up to 3 months, those type of things. There's nothing wrong with that. That's actually great. That just gives a little built-in fertilizer. The problem, though, is that's not going to get our plants through the entire summer here in Kansas for a couple of reasons. First of all, those are slow release. They're short term. The other thing is, as the soil heats up with our summer conditions and we put the water through them, those break down a lot more rapidly. So even some people say, if the package says feed your plant for 3 months, in our Kansas summers with the heat and with the amount of water, it may last half that time. So to get those containers, whether they're vegetable or flowers, through the entire season, I would tell you to start getting on a watering schedule, maybe about a month, 6 weeks or so after planting those containers that have a fertilizer mixed in at the start.
Back to the container, how big should it be, Dennis? That relates to the likely growing potential of that plant?
Right. Well, first of all, the larger the container you have, the lower the maintenance is going to be, because you're going to have to water it quite as frequently. And the larger the container, the bigger plants you can put in there. So if you're wanting to grow like a tomato plant, a pepper plant, I always like to kind of use a relationship to a 5-gallon bucket, because people can kind of understand the volume of a 5-gallon bucket. So for a larger tomato plant, pepper, somewhere in the 5 gallons of volume of soil, I think is really, to my mind, is about the smallest a container should be. These little cutesy 6-inch, 8-inch pots you see on the patios, those are going to be a watering nightmare. And so I think that 5 to 7 gallons is a nice size to start, and then you can work up from there. And, why just have one container? If you're going to go to the trouble of making container gardening, if you've got room, put 3, 4 together, because then that simplifies watering. It increases the amount of things you can plant in there. It increases the amount of flowers and just makes it more attractive, and almost becomes more like a little mini container garden instead of just a pot here, pot there.
All right. Well, there are a few tips on succeeding with container gardening. Next week, Dennis, we'll have you back to take up the topic of raised bed gardening. Until then, many thanks.
Thank you, Eric.
Dennis Patton, our guest for this week's horticulture segment, Johnson County Extension Horticulture Agent. And our time is away once again. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.